poorly on Machen, but it gives you an assessment of Warfield.
Yeah, I mean, and this is all sort of kind of relativism, but Harvard, pristine Harvard, was liberal Unitarian Harvard, was not admitting Jews or blacks during that time.
Yeah.
I mean, it was the North was no less segregated than the South. It's just that the North didn't have all the Jim Crow laws that the South did, nor did the North have the demographics that the South did, which means that whites were clearly in the majority in the North in a way that parts of the South they weren't. But Machen was a man of his times, and so that was part of his being upset about that.
Dr. Hart.
I would recommend people to read the chapter that Brad Gudlak wrote in the book that we did on Warfield's, the recent release book that I edited on Warfield, which portrays Warfield's sensitivity to that issue.
I mean, I could get back at Jagari and talk about how Warfield was also maybe an evolutionist because of his time breeding horses.
Yes.
Which would maybe startle a number of listeners, but anyway. I mean, all men have feet of clay, so.
That's right.
Dr. Hart, I'm wondering if you could tell us just a little bit about Machen's preaching, because I know with men like Warfield and Machen, we often hear about these great scholastic works they produce because they were just amazing theologians. But maybe, I don't know, have you come across things that you could share with us about the sermons in God Transcendent, or just stories that you've come across about Machen's preaching?
I think he was a great writer and probably a great orator. I've never heard him. No recordings survive. But I've been struck by how many times I've taught about Machen that students, even contemporary students, iPod, internet savvy students, will read Christianity and Liberalism and see that there's a real clarity of style to Machen. So he was a great communicator, and this is, I think, a possible subject for somebody who wants to do a dissertation, which is to look at the sermons of that era, the sermons being produced by Princeton Seminary graduates. I don't think that presbyteries today, at least in the OPC, would be overly impressed with these sermons as far as being exegetical, as careful as they should be. And yet, I mean, someone like Clarence McCartney has collections of sermons. He was a board member at Princeton. He was a colleague of Machen's as a student, board member at Princeton, board member at Westminster, one of the great preachers of the era. And I haven't been overly impressed with his sermons either, as far as what we think today sermons should do. So I'm wondering what sort of homiletics courses were being taught, who was teaching them, and what the ideal of a good sermon was back then. So Machen was always clear in his presentation of the gospel, but he could get pretty far from the text.
Of course, also McCartney was also a lifelong bachelor.
Right. One great example of Machen getting far from the text, and Camden, since you brought up Fosdick's Shall the Fundamentalists Win? Machen basically had a rival sermon to that, preached at the end of 1923, so it was almost a year and a half later. And I can't remember the title, but Machen goes so far from the text that I can't even remember what the text for the sermon was, but he goes on to a long harangue about civil liberty and how if there's ever going to be a revival in the country, there needs to be a return to civil liberties. And then he also talks about how there also needs to be intolerance in the church. So he makes all these sorts of really good points. And there's one section in particular where he illustrates how relativistic liberalism is by saying, 6 times 9 no longer means 54, it means 108. Or, the Constitution of the United States was written not in Philadelphia, but San Francisco, because we as moderns need to reinterpret these old truths in the light of contemporary developments. And so he leads people on to finally, okay, you affirm when you recite the Nicene Creed or the Apostles' Creed that Christ died from the dead on the third day, and the person says, well, no, we no longer, that's the old way of conceiving of Christ's resurrection. We no longer believe that. No, we're modern men. So when we affirm that Christ was raised from the dead, we really mean Christ wasn't raised from the dead. And it's a very effective rhetorical device to show how relativistic liberalism is. But again, I'm not sure he was faithfully preaching the text at that point. Yeah. There is a place for doctrinal sermons, I think. And actually, I'm quite a fan or an advocate. I can't call myself a fan because there's so little of it. An advocate of catechetical preaching. So I think there's a real place for doctrinal preaching. But as far as the sort of exegetical preaching that's valued in Westminster Seminary circles, both East and California, I'm actually not sure Machen would measure up.
Of course, there was McCartney's famous sermon, Shall Unbelief Win, which was a response to Fosdick.
Right. But the notable thing, and Machen always credited McCartney with being the one to almost single-handedly stand up to Fosdick in the church, and Machen had great respect for McCartney. At the time, McCartney was a minister in Philadelphia at Arch Street Presbyterian Church, which is an amazing facility building, and it looks like it's the sort of church that will endure well beyond our Lord's return, because it's really built to stay. But and Machen preached there several times. But the reason why I think of Machen's sermon at the end of 1923 as a kind of rival to Fosdick's is because Machen's sermon created a great furor in the press. One of the pew holders at First Presbyterian Church, Princeton at the time, was Henry Van Dyke, who taught literature.
Relative. Yeah.
Yes, but also taught literature at Princeton University, had been the ambassador to the Netherlands during the Wilson administration. So this guy was well-connected, a well-respected writer. And he resigned his pew after that sermon and held a press conference, sent out press releases, and kind of was a dandy about it. And so Machen's sermon was reprinted throughout the press around the country in ways comparable to the ways Fosdick's sermon was circulated. And so in some ways that caught the public eye in a way that Fosdick's sermon did. And in a way that I think McCartney's didn't, even though McCartney's was a direct response within like a month or so of the Fosdick sermon.
Just for a light of application, can you imagine that happening today? The major presses like USA Today carrying a sermon like that? Not a chance.
Well, some of the presidential candidates have been getting close to sermonizing, but...
Well, even Fosdick, he was on the cover of Time magazine, which might not be as strange as today if someone like a Joel Osteen or somebody was on the cover, but still, it was a different time. One thing Mather wrote, referring to Machen on preaching, I have this quote here. He says, although he never taught homiletics, there is valuable instruction from Machen for young preachers. And Machen said, the Bible is the only way to avoid monotony in the pulpit, he told his students. And when the cross of Christ is faithfully preached, only then can the minister experience the joy of elevating listeners out of the crash and jazz and noise and rattle and smoke of this weary age. So it's interesting to see Machen's own views or own thoughts as he taught and encouraged his students in preaching, even though he didn't teach that himself.
Darryl, didn't Machen's book, The Christian Doctrine of Man, originate as a series of radio lectures?
Right. The Christian View of Man and Christian Faith in the Modern World, the one Christian Faith in the Modern World published posthumously, were a series of radio addresses given on, of all things, for those people in the Philadelphia area, WIP.
The sports station.
Right. And it was a way for the seminary to do publicity. Sunday afternoons, Machen would do a talk, and it would go out, and he was expositing oftentimes the shorter catechism, trying to address specific issues in the church. So it was a little bit of Sabbath instruction on the radio.
And none of those survived.
The tapes do not.
We have no recordings of those.
No.
Oh.
Dr. Hart, I wanted to ask you about